In 1886, in the industrial city of Manchester, England, doctors at the Royal Hospital uncovered something that would haunt them for decades. In the damp, dimly lit basement of the hospital, they stumbled upon a hidden laboratory that looked like it had been pulled straight from a Victorian nightmare. Glass jars filled with perfectly preserved human organs lined the shelves, alongside handwritten diaries describing anatomical details far beyond what was possible for that time. And at the center of it all sat surgical instruments made for a child. The mastermind behind this disturbing collection was only 12 years old. His name was Edmund Blackwood, a boy who turned death into his obsession. But what the doctors uncovered in his work didn't just challenge the medical knowledge of the irate, shook the very boundaries of reality itself. This is the true story of a child prodigy who crossed lines that were never meant to be crossed. A story that the British Medical Archives tried to erase for more than a century. To understand what Edmund Blackwood managed to achieve, we need to step back into the world of Victorian England in the 1880s. It was a time of staggering contradictions. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping society at lightning speed, yet medicine was still in its infancy. Louis Pasteur's germ theory was only beginning to gain acceptance. Many doctors still ignored sterilization, and anesthesia, though discovered, was used sparingly because of its deadly risks. Manchester, one of England's most important industrial centers, thrived with textile factories but suffered with disease and staggering child mortality. In the city's working-class neighborhoods, life expectancy barely reached 35 years. It was here, in March 1874, that Edmund Blackwood was born, the son of a wealthy textile merchant and a mother who tragically died giving birth. That loss, according to later records, would leave a deep mark on his psyche. From an early age, Edmund displayed extraordinary intelligence. By age 4, he was already reading medical texts from his father's private library. By 6, he could recite anatomical treatises in Latin from memory. But there was something unsettling about his brilliance. Servants at the Blackwood estate, whose memoirs were discovered in 1987, claimed the boy spent hours watching dead animals in the garden, not with a child's curiosity, but with the cold detachment of a scientist. The first undeniable evidence of his experiments surfaced in the winter of 1884, when Edmund was only 10. The family gardener, Thomas Whitmore, discovered something horrifying in an abandoned barn on the property. According to the report, Whitmore gave police uncovered decades later in 1923, he found a makeshift table covered with crude surgical instruments. On it lay the remains of cats, rabbits, and birds. But these weren't simply dead animals. They had been dissected with chilling precision, their organs carefully removed and preserved in glass jars, each one labeled in Edmund's neat handwriting. Next to the table was a diary filled with detailed notes. In it, Edmund described decomposition, the effects of chemicals on tissues, and methods of preservation that even professional anatomists struggled to master. When confronted by his parents, Edmund showed no guilt. Instead, he calmly explained that he was studying what he called the mechanisms of vital transition, a term he had invented himself. The family doctor, Aldrich Petton, was summoned to examine the boy. In notes uncovered years later, Petton described Edmund as a brilliant mind trapped in a child's body, driven by an obsession with death that bordered on the morbid. Most disturbing of all, Edmund had developed his own theory about something he called vital energy. According to his notes, he believed a measurable force left the body at the moment of death and that it could be captured and studied. But, instead of seeking psychiatric help, Dr. Petton made a fateful mistake. Fascinated by Edmund's genius, he encouraged it. He gave the boy advanced medical texts, and even allowed him to sit in on his consultations. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire. By April of 1886, Petton had secured Edmund a special scholarship at Manchester Royal Hospital. Officially, the 12-year-old was labeled a junior research assistant. In practice, He had nearly unrestricted access to the hospital's laboratories and to the morgue. At first, everything seemed harmless. Senior doctors praised Edmund as a prodigy. He asked sharp questions during autopsies and displayed knowledge that surpassed most medical students. But subtle warnings were ignored. A nurse named Margaret Thornfield wrote to her sister in London letters, later discovered in 1964, that Edmund often lingered in the morgue after hours, claiming he was making supplementary observations. The night janitor, James McKinnon, also left records of strange sightings. He reported faint lights flickering in the basement during the early hours of the morning, accompanied by noises that sounded like a mix of surgical tools and whispers. Everything came to a breaking point in September 1886. Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, head of pathology, arrived early one morning and decided to inspect the basement. What he found would scar him forever. The laboratory had been transformed. Surgical tables were arranged in an eerie, ritual-like order. Dozens of jars contained not only organs, but strange bodily fluids that glowed with an unnatural light. And covering the walls were complex diagrams, Edmund's own creations that merged anatomy with symbols and notations that looked disturbingly esoteric. At the heart of the basement lab lay the most chilling discovery of all. Edmund had built a machine he called the vital essence captor, a grotesque hybrid of Victorian medical gear and alchemical apparatus. Glass tubes twisted into primitive electrodes circled a modified operating table, wires snaking into jars and contraptions that looked as if half science and half superstition had been welded together. According to Edmund's meticulous notes, the device was designed to detect and trap whatever force left the body at the moment of death. But Dr. Harrison Blackthorne didn't stop at theory. He found proof Edmund had tested the machine. Hospital records show at least 7 cadavers from the morgue had been hooked to the contraption. These were not standard autopsies. Edmund attached electrodes, monitored readings, and recorded results with the clinical calm of an experienced researcher, and, in his notebooks, he claimed the device worked. To grasp the scope of those experiments, you must read Edmund's confiscated papers, documents the hospital quietly locked away for decades. His scientific diary reads like the work of a seasoned anatomist. He measured post-mortem tissue changes at precise 15-minute intervals over the first 24 hours after death. Using a microscope, he'd modified himself. But Edmund wasn't interested in decay for its own sake. He hunted a moment he called the transition window, a narrow period after clinical death, when he believed the body still held a measurable spark of something he called the vital essence. His methods grew bolder. The vital essence captor was hooked to galvanometers and primitive amplifiers. Electrodes probed hearts, temples, and spinal tissue. The readings, Edmund wrote, were repeatable, but more than numbers appeared. He began to detect pattern-structured fluctuations that, to him, looked like attempts at order. In an entry dated August 15, 1886, he wrote, "The essence does not dissipate randomly. There is pattern, a striving for coherence. It reads like communication." Page after page of his diary contained sequences of marks, numbers, and symbols Edmund believed were translations of those electrical patterns. And here the account turns from unsettling to terrifying. Edmund claimed the sequences conveyed fragments of the dying person's last conscious moments, sensory impressions, fleeting images, even words. In other words, the boy believed he had found a way to listen to the dead. The night of September 23, 1886, would end the experiments and begin the scandal. Edmund requested permission to work overnight on a critical trial. Dr. Petton, still entranced by his protege's brilliance, granted it. At 11:47 p.m., janitor James McKinnon made his rounds and later testified to seeing bright, unusual lights under the basement door and hearing a low, musical hum, an electrical vibration that set the hair on his arms. Curiosity won out for some. McKinnon admitted later he thought it was just another one of the boy's strange projects. It was the last time anyone saw Edmund alive. When Blackthorne arrived the next morning, the lab door was locked from the inside. A locksmith pried it open. Inside, chaos, overturned tables, shattered jars, instruments strewn like bones. The vital essence captor lay wrecked, ripped apart as if from an immense internal force, and Edmund, gone. They searched the hospital, the grounds, every possible hiding place. Nothing. It was as if the boy had evaporated. 3 days later, among the wreckage, they found his diary open to the final entry, stamped September 23rd at 11:30 p.m. The handwriting was jagged, panicked, unlike his usual precise script. It worked beyond expectation. The entry began. The barrier is thinner than I imagined. They are trying to communicate, not echoes, but intent. They know I am here. They want, oh God, they want to return. The essence is not mere energy. It is appetite, an unending hunger for life. I have opened a door. I have made a terrible mistake. I can hear them coming. The air is freezing. The lights are failing. If you find this, destroy everything. Burn the notes. Do not let this be repeated. Death is no longer an ending. It is a prison I have unlocked. That last frantic warning set off a frantic cover-up. Manchester Royal Hospital's administration moved quickly to control the narrative. In the days after the lab was trashed, the building itself seemed to betray logic. Sudden cold spots materialized in wards. Staff whispered of murmurs and things that moved on their own, and medical devices failed without cause. Even Blackthorne, the practical, scientifically minded head of pathology, shifted from skeptic to believer after his own late-night experience, which he described in memoirs published posthumously in 1923. 1 week after Edmund vanished, Blackthorne was working alone when he heard slow, familiar footsteps outside his door. He opened it, expecting a colleague, but found only corridor air and the faint echo of a voice that repeated his name in a cadence he could not place. That night, he wrote, something brushed his shoulder as if passing through him, leaving a sting and a smell he later compared to burned papers and cold iron. He never again entered the basement alone. From that night on, the hospital's official records grew sparse and evasive. Files vanished, diaries were misfiled, and the administration quietly sealed the basement. Yet rumors leaked out: nurses who woke to whispers above their heads, patients who swore they saw a small figure darting between wards, and a pervasive chill in corners where no draft could be found. Edmund Blackwood's disappearance and the wrecked laboratory forced Manchester's medical community into a corner. Expose a scandal that would ruin reputations, or bury the evidence and protect the institution. They chose concealment. For more than a century, the documents were locked away, until the mid-20th century inquiries that finally forced those sealed pages back into daylight. Blackthorne swore the footsteps were Edmund's. He opened the door, and the corridor was empty, but the air had turned ice. Worse, the sound seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, as if someone paced in the sealed basement lab that everyone thought had been shut for good. Soon, others began reporting the same things. Nurse Margaret Thornfield claimed she'd seen a small silhouette move behind the barred window of the walled-up lab. Janitor McKinnon found instruments smashed and then oddly rearranged in the dead of night. The hospital administration finally took drastic action. In October 1886, less than a month after Edmund vanished, they sealed the basement for good. They bricked the doorway, welded the windows, and poured concrete into the vents. Officially, it was structural renovation. The truth was far darker. They were trying to lock something inside, but containment didn't stop the events. If anything, they got worse. Patients in the upper wards began waking from nightmares haunted by the same boy. In dream after dream, a Victorian-looking child would appear at their bedside and ask the same cold questions Edmund had once put to his subjects. What do you feel when you approach death? Is something waiting on the other side? Even scarier, some of those dreaming patients woke with knowledge they could not possibly have learned. Uneducated laborers described surgical procedures in clinical detail. Retired seamstresses rattled off anatomical terms they'd never studied. It was as if Edmund's work continued through other people's sleeping minds. Manchester Royal limped on for decades, but the institution was dying from within. Publicly, it closed in 1923 because the facility was outdated. Privately, the decision grew from a long string of unexplainable incidents that made the hospital impossible to run. In 1892, Dr. Petone, Edmund's original mentor, suffered a nervous collapse and was committed. Letters he wrote from the asylum, found only in 1967, revealed he had secretly tried to rebuild the vital lessons chapter. "I succeeded," he confessed in frantic handwriting. "I heard his voice. But he was not the boy I knew. He was hungry. He told me how to open the door wider, to use a living body as a gateway." Petton's last letters end in terror. "I burned the machine. I burned the notes. It is too late. They know we are here." 3 days later, he was found dead in his cell. Officially, cardiac arrest. Unofficially, his body showed signs of accelerated decay and an unnaturally low temperature. Details that chilled the coroner. Strange events kept plaguing the site. In 1908, an unexplained blaze consumed the wing above Edmund's sealed lab. Investigators never found a cause. During World War I, wounded soldiers treated their told doctors about a boy who visited them and asked about dying, and the reports of war neuroses spiked to alarming levels. Then, in 1987, demolition crews tearing down the old hospital made a discovery that reopened the case. Behind the reinforced wall that had been poured in 1886, Edmund's lab lay remarkably intact, as if time itself had slowed in that one room. Dr. Sarah Whitmore led the archaeological team. She was, by coincidence, the great-granddaughter of Thomas Whitmore, the gardener who'd first stumbled on Edmund's barn. What they found was unnerving. The vital essence captor still sat in the center of the room, but new parts had been added, pieces that shouldn't exist for the 1880s. There were crude radio valves, vacuum tubes, and copper coils wired into ritual-like. Someone had carried the work forward long after Edmund vanished. Even stranger were the papers, stacks, and Edmund's unmistakable hand, but dated decades later. 1901, 1923, 1955, even 1978. The letters implied one of two terrible things. Either Edmund somehow continued his experiments across the 20th century, or something was imitating him, using his handwriting, his voice, his work to keep the door ajar. The letters described Edmund's growing mastery over what he called the vital essence and his increasingly advanced ways of contacting the intermediate realm. One letter from 1965 stood out. In it, he gave detailed blueprints for a modernized version of his device, this time powered by electronic components. Edmund wrote, "Science has finally caught up to me. With these new electronics, my communication will expand far beyond this primitive laboratory." The letter ended with a chilling vow. "The experiments will continue. Death is only the beginning of true research. Those with open minds will find me. I will be waiting." The 1987 discovery set off fierce debates among historians, skeptics, and paranormal researchers. The mainstream explanation painted Edmund as nothing more than a brilliant but unstable boy who hid inside the hospital and eventually died. According to them, the later letters were forgeries, but that theory ignored some disturbing facts. Who could have secretly entered a sealed laboratory for decades? How could anyone in the early 1900s know about technologies not invented until much later? The second theory, popular among paranormal investigators, argued that Edmund succeeded in transcending death itself. His consciousness lingered between life and death, continuing his experiments across decades. This theory gained weight from the many apparitions of a Victorian boy recorded in hospitals. worldwide, always asking the same questions about death, fear, and what lies beyond. But the third theory was far more unsettling. Proposed by Dr. Sarah Whitmore, it claimed Edmund hadn't escaped death, he had broken it. She believed his experiments ripped a hole in the boundary between life and death, allowing other dead consciousnesses to slip into our world. Edmund wasn't just a survivor of this rupture, he was its architect, using it to fuel his growing experiments. Reports backed this up. In the 20th century, researchers across the globe claimed encounters with a boy in Victorian clothes who offered forbidden knowledge in exchange for help. Some scientists even admitted, in private, to collaborating with him. Their results were groundbreaking but horrifying. Several described consciousness bleeding, moments when they could hear the thoughts of the dead. One such man, Dr. Michael Harrison of Boston University, went public. He said, Edmund taught him how to detect brain activity after death, proof that consciousness persisted. But soon he began hearing the voices of deceased patients, and abandoned the research to keep his sanity. In 2019, Tokyo General Hospital reignited the case. Security cameras captured a translucent figure matching Edmund's description wandering the corridors at 3 a.m. toward the neurology lab. The next morning, researchers found their equipment altered, with data files containing medical research decades ahead of its time. Authorities tried to suppress the evidence, but the leaked footage was undeniable. Now, more than 130 years since his first experiments, Edmund Blackwood's presence still lingers. Around the world, wherever cutting-edge research on death and consciousness is taking place, his shadow seems to follow. Some believe he has become something beyond human consciousness, stretching across multiple dimensions. Others believe he never died at all. One thing is certain. In 1886, Edmund opened a door that may never close. His obsession with death turned him into something that science still cannot explain. The boy who treated death as a laboratory may have found that the laboratory is endless, and humanity itself is his test subject. And if the stories are true, Edmund Blackwood is still out there, searching for his next assistant. If this tale of Victorian terror and forbidden science gripped you as much as it disturbed you, subscribe for more mysteries from the dark edges of history. Tap the notification bell, because the next story we tell might just follow you into your dreams. Until then, remember, some doors once opened can never be shut.